Okay, so chapter 13, we are going to cover the respiratory system. So first of all, some kind of generalized functions of the respiratory system. It allows for gas exchange between the air outside of us and the blood inside our body. It allows air to move in and out of our body so we can actually exchange the air. It protects respiratory surfaces from pollutants, allergens, etc. It allows us to speak, production of sound, seeing any sounds that we make, and also olfaction, or the sense of smell, is through the respiratory system, of course, within the nasal cavity as well. So first of all, respiration involves pulmonary ventilation. That is the technical term for what breathing is. So that is the actual movement of air inside of the lungs as we breathe in and out of the lungs as we exhale or breathe out. So external respiration is the movement of gases within the lungs, what I just explained. Transportation of respiratory gases would involve the cardiovascular system, okay, moving now the oxygenated blood to the specific artery that's going to serve a general area or region of any particular organ, and then to the capillaries where you can actually have the oxygen being dropped off to the tissues and picking up the waste gas CO2. Internal respiration would be that movement of gases within the tissue. Okay, so again, moving the oxygen to the cells, picking up the waste gas. So components of the respiratory system, you can see here that we have division between the upper and respiratory systems. I know y'all talked about that in lab. Let's see, on page 118 through 120 in your lab manual. Okay, so you can look back over those. Okay, so the respiratory tract, we're of course going to focus on physiology and the structures that are involved with that. Respiratory tract are the conducting passageways. Conduction basically means the organs or structures which allow air to pass. And we have to take them to these small sacs in the lungs, the alveoli, because that's where gas exchange can occur. So other things that the respiratory tract does as well. In our nasal cavity, we are going to add moisture, add heat to the air that comes in. We're also going to, we have pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. And the goblet cells in the cilia will attract pollutants, allergens, so hopefully they do not go down to the delicate alveoli. The lower passageways will be smaller. Again, they're taking the air further and further down the alveoli. And so we call this branching of these conducting areas, basically, as soon as you start with the trachea, the respiratory tree. So the trachea branches into your left and right primary bronchi, okay, which is the first portions of the respiratory tree. And then the bronchi get smaller and smaller until they become bronchioles. So if I go back here, if you look at the picture that you have in your book, it's more general. But one thing to note, as we move closer to the alveoli, the amount of hyaline cartilage that's around the bronchi decreases, and the amount of smooth muscle increases. And that's actually the main difference between bronchi and bronchioles. By the time you get to the bronchioles, they are all smooth muscle. Okay, so bronchioles do not contain any cartilage, just smooth muscle. Thought we had a... So within the lower respiratory tract, you actually have the respiratory membrane. So these are the layers of cells in which we are going to have gas exchange. So we want it to be very thin so the gas can diffuse easily. So we basically have between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. So the alveoli has an epithelium, which is going to be simple squamous, and a basement membrane. And then the capillary epithelium, if you remember, capillaries all have simple squamous as well. We call that endothelium. And then the basement membrane will actually fuse. So oxygen diffuses from the alveolus into the capillaries. Remember, diffusion is a type of passive transport. So that means that gases are going to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So here we have more oxygen in the alveoli than we do the capillaries. That's why oxygen moves into the blood. And we have more carbon dioxide in the capillaries than in the alveolus. And that's why carbon dioxide moves into the alveoli for then us to exhale. Okay, so this is just a description again showing the simple squamous of both the layers with the fused basement membrane. Again, the very thin layer allows for easy diffusion here. So most of these cells within the alveoli are these little simple squamous cells that form the alveolus. But you do have other cells as well, I just want to point out. So you have what we call fixed macrophages, where macrophages are phagocytic. So anything possibly that made it to the lungs that wasn't caught by the cilia and the mucus will be attacked here. And you also have these other cells that are going to make surfactant, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, so just a few notes about the larynx. The larynx is where our vocal cords are. So this is where the production of sound occurs. So remember, itis is when you have inflammation of any structure. So this is inflammation of the larynx, and it makes your voice be a little hoarse because of this. Of course, you might hear that a little bit in mine right now. And then you have the itis. You can have the inflammation. It gets very severe, and it makes its way to the epiglottis. Remember, the epiglottis is one of the two structures that's comprised of elastic cartilage, and it actually protects and covers the glottis when we swallow food, liquid, basically anything that we want to go down the digestive tract. So if the epiglottis gets too swollen, it actually prevents air from being able to enter the larynx and therefore the respiratory tree, which would result in suffocation and death if it's not fixed immediately. So now talking about the lungs, of course, which is where the alveoli are located. Remember, the lungs are within the ventral body cavity, and all organs within the ventral body cavity have serous membranes. And these serous membranes in the lungs we call pleura or pleural membranes. So each lung is comprised, very specifically, the surface that directly covers each lung is the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura actually lines the left and right pleural cavities, which is the space in which the lung sits. So between those two layers, you have a small amount of fluid, the pleural fluid, and this is supposed to reduce friction between any other structures. Remember, the heart's right in between the lungs, so as it expands, you don't want friction to be created. Okay, so now we're going to talk about just some of the key steps which actually occur in respiration. So we talked about pulmonary ventilation again. That's the technical word for breathing. So of course, breathing in technically is called inspiration. So gases are going to move into the lungs. Expiration, or when gases exit the lungs. So what determines pulmonary ventilation is actually a change in volume, because changing the volume or the size of our lungs will change the pressure. And just like we saw with the cardiovascular system, and we were just talking about with diffusion, everything goes from high pressure to low pressure. Okay, so we're going to describe the pressure inside of our lungs in comparison to what we call the atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure of gases in the environment, the air around us. So basically what we're going to see here, this is just a very simple representation trying to show that when the lungs are smaller, the gas molecules that are inside the lungs are going to hit the sides of the wall and each other more. Remember, because of kinetic energy, molecules are always in movement. So if you increase the volume, so we're going to increase the volume here, what we're going to see is the pressure is going to decrease, because now the gas molecules will not hit each other or the sides of the wall as often. Okay, so you see an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. So here we saw the volume decrease, that's why the pressure rose. Okay, so that's exactly what we see here. Inspiration and expiration are totally based on being able to change the volume of our lungs. And we do that by changing the volume of the thoracic cage or cavity. Okay, so your thoracic cage is comprised of your ribs and the sternum. And because the lungs are attached to the thoracic cavity by that parietal pleura, when the thoracic cage expands, it forces the lungs to expand as well. So air will continue to move in as we increase the volume. We've decreased the pressure. So air will continue to move in until the pressure is equalized. The pressure we're talking about again is the pressure, the atmospheric pressure that's outside of the lungs, and the pressure inside of our lungs, which we call the intrapulmonary pressure. Okay, so here they're just showing you the thoracic cage. So again, as we breathe in, the volume increases. Why does the volume increase? Because when we inhale, or what makes us inhale, the diaphragm is going to flatten. So as the diaphragm flattens, that pulls the lungs downward, and then you have other muscles that are going to pull the lungs, the thoracic cage outward. So again, the pressure inside the lungs is now dropped, so we're going to have air moving in until the pressure is equal. Okay, then we're going to stop contracting these muscles. The diaphragm is going to move in its other position, so the lung are going to get more squished. Okay, you also see that the muscles have relaxed here, so it goes back to its normal position. And so the volume has decreased. Now the pressure is higher inside the lungs. It's higher here than it is in the atmosphere, and that's why we breathe out. Okay, again, until that pressure is equalized. So breathing in is an active process. What that means, our muscles must contract. And of course, we're talking about skeletal muscles. So we must expand or increase that thoracic volume, the thoracic cage. So again, the pressure inside the lungs, that's what we call the intrapulmonary pressure. As we expand the lungs, the pressure is going to decrease. Okay, so again, that's why air is going to move in. And again, air moves in until it's equal, until we reach a pressure gradient. So air movement will stop. Then we're going to quit breathing in. So with expiration, it's what we call a passive process. Specifically, we're talking about quiet. So what do we mean by quiet? When you're not forcing to exhale. Okay, most of the time when you're in parasympathetic and breathing normally. Okay, so not working out, not when you're trying to take really deep breaths, or if you're stressed. Okay, so you actually do not require muscles to contract here. That's what we mean by passive. So it's simply that the muscles that helped us breathe in relax. Okay, when they relax, that stops pulling the pressure, stops expanding the thoracic cage, so the volume decreases. We know that makes the pressure rise. Okay, so the intrapulmonary pressure rises, and that's what's going to make us force air to move out. Again, until we reach the pressure gradient. So you want it to be 0. Equal amount of gases inside the lungs creating the pressure and in the atmosphere. However, forced expiration. So again, when you breathe in and out, when you're working out, when you're trying to take deep breaths, it does involve muscles. Okay, so we're going to use our abdominal muscles. They help compress and get rid of more air, and then what we call the internal intercostals. Intercostals are the muscles that are in between your ribs. And I should have noted the muscles which help you to breathe in are going to be the diaphragm and your external intercostals. And again, those are used even when you're quiet breathing. When you breathe in, additionally, there are other muscles that help. There are other muscles within the pectoral region, but we're really not going to talk about those. Okay, well, there's some other factors that basically influence your ability to breathe. Okay, that's what pulmonary ventilation is. So the muscles which help us breathe in, okay, of course, skeletal muscles require energy, ATP energy, and they basically must be to overcome these three factors. Otherwise, you cannot breathe in. So they have to overcome what we're going to call the airway resistance. We're going to talk about these, the alveolar surface tension, and lung compliance. We're actually going to talk about all these in quite detail except lung compliance. So just a quick note right now. Lung compliance is basically the ability of your lungs to expand and recoil. Really, that's affected by the recoiling. Some elastic fibers are like a rubber band. Once you're done stretching them, they should recoil. As we get older, they do not. So if the volume doesn't decrease as much, we can't exhale as much. And then, of course, that affects our ability to breathe in as well. So airway resistance is going to be the friction that basically wants to hinder or stop the movement of gas. Okay, so obviously gas is going to flow where there's less resistance. So we want to keep the resistance in our respiratory pathway as low as possible. Okay, as resistance rises, breathing becomes more strenuous. You can kind of hear sometimes people struggling to breathe. That's because the airway resistance typically has increased. So what could make your airway resistance increase? That's when you have bronchioles that are constricting. Remember, bronchioles are comprised totally of smooth muscle. So if that smooth muscle is constricting, you're going to block the air passageways. Or if something specifically is blocking. Obstruction could be fluid. It could be specifically fluid. I usually mean water or mucus. It could be blood. It could be something that's actually blocking. Maybe if someone's injured, okay, some hard tissue that's blocking the passageways. So a lot of times what we see this is people that have asthma. Okay, their bronchioles will constrict. So they will take an inhaler. The inhaler basically forces the bronchioles to increase. What also dilates bronchioles is epinephrine. Remember, epinephrine is what is released in part of our autonomic nervous system. That's the part that happens automatically. We don't have to think about it when we are in sympathetic mode. So fight or flight response, we're going to dilate our bronchioles. So it's going to be much easier to get oxygen into the lungs. Obviously, if you're in sympathetic mode, your body's going to be needing more oxygen. Okay, so the other factor was the alveolar surface tension. So surface tension is the tension when you have liquid molecules. Basically, if you remember, water's polar. And so polar molecules, opposites, positive and negative, tend to want to attract to one another. So liquid attracts to the sides. So basically, the sides of your alveoli tend to want to stick together, which means that they would not be open. So what we have to break the surface tension is the surfactant. This is the material I was talking about that's produced by the other type of cells that are within the alveoli. So type 1 are just the regular, simple squamous cells that actually form the alveoli. Type 2 are the type that produce this liquid, okay, that is, it basically emulsifies or breaks down the surface tension. So think about if you have oil or butter and you're trying to clean off a pan, you have to use some type of soap or detergent to kind of break through that layer to get that grease or the oil off. Same idea here. Okay, so it discourages the alveoli basically to be collapsed and to want to stick together and make sure that they stay nice and open. Just a small note, the lungs are one of the last things to develop in the fetus, and surfactant is not produced. That's why a lot of premature babies have to be on ventilators or they're given steroids, which will help basically increase the amount, speed up the amount of surfactant that their cells are producing. Okay, so with quiet breathing, which we term apnea, Oh, and here's the muscles I mentioned earlier. Remember, for expiration, you still have to have muscles which are going to expand your thoracic cage and therefore increase the volume. So you have to be able to contract the diaphragm and the external intercostals. Which one does more is more important? That would definitely be the diaphragm. Forced breathing, which is what we term hyperpnea. So this would be, again, exercising, working out, basically when you're in sympathetic mode. That's going to involve additional muscles. So again, we mentioned the internal intercostals. Sorry, I kind of split that word together. Will be involved, as well as some of your abdominal muscles to compress the rib cage even further. Okay, so we had a cardiac cycle, which was all of the heart chambers contracting. We also have a respiratory cycle. So respiratory cycle is basically a single cycle of a person breathing in or inhaling and exhaling. Okay, and we can see how often they have respiratory cycles to help assess basically the health of the respiratory system. And the amount that's moved in when you are in normal breathing, okay, so apnea, is what we call tidal volume. It's called the TV. It's the amount of air that's moved in one cycle, in and out during normal breathing. Not that y'all have to know this. I don't think y'all talk about it in lab here. I think it's AMP1, but that's about 500 milliliters for both males and females. Okay, so this air that moves in, what we're really concerned with here is the oxygen, okay, because the oxygen is what we need to enter the blood and then to go to the cells. Remember, we have to have oxygen to allow cellular respiration to occur, to allow more ATP. Of course, ATP is the chemical energy that most of our cells utilize. So how do we carry oxygen? Most of the oxygen is carried actually on the red blood cells. About 98% of the oxygen is actually carried on the red blood cells. Specifically within a component which we call the hemoglobin. I want to be really specific. It would be the heme component, which is iron. That's why iron does affect the amount of oxygen that you can carry. However, the amount of oxygen that can be carried with the red blood cell depends on, and therefore hemoglobin, depends on what we call PO2. That is what we call the partial pressure of oxygen, which, simple translation, how much the oxygen we have. Okay, so the amount of oxygen that we have, as opposed to the other gases that we're breathing in. pH, okay, which we're going to talk about, that's of course on our scale from 1 to 14. Technically 0 to 14. Okay, 7 being neutral. Remember, the lower the number, the more acidic you are. The higher the number, the more we call basic or alkaline. And then we're going to look at how temperature affects that as well. One thing to note, the red blood cells in the fetus has a higher affinity for oxygen than adult. Affinity is basically its ability to bind, which makes sense. In the fetus, your tissues are growing, so a depredation of oxygen would be even more problematic. Okay, so we're going to look at some of these factors specifically. So, remember, glucose is the simple sugar that our cells most readily use to break down to actually get our ATP. Okay, well, what happens is, as we metabolize glucose, the amount of hydrogen increases. Remember, hydrogen directly is a measure of acid. So if hydrogen increases, your acid gets stronger. Okay, so we would say the pH would decline. Okay, so the dropping of the pH actually weakens the hemoglobin binding to the oxygen. Okay, so that bond is weaker. We call that the Bohr effect. Okay, so acid, lower the pH, weakens the bond. And then also we see a rise in temperature. Okay, now looking at heat. So as temperature increases, again, the oxygen binding to the hemoglobin decreases. Okay, so a drop in pH and a rise in temperature are going to decrease the bond of oxygen to hemoglobin. What does that mean? Your tissues can become starved of oxygen. They're not going to be receiving as much oxygen. And that's what we call hypoxia. Okay, that's a state in which your cells, tissues are not getting enough oxygen. So it could be caused by, a few different things. Of course, we did mention the effects already of temperature and pH on it. Also looking at the number of red blood cells. Okay, so oxygen has to be bound to red blood cells. So if you don't have as many of those, you're not going to be getting as much oxygen. Or what is inside of the red blood cells, which is what oxygen actually binds to, hemoglobin. Okay, HB is just short for hemoglobin. If part of your circulation is blocked, maybe an artery, you have a lot of plaque buildup. Okay, obviously blood is carrying the oxygen. If you have metabolic poisons that add up, again, too much CO2, okay, not being able to remove the body from natural metabolic waste. Pulmonary disease in which you're unable to bring enough oxygen into the body. And then carbon monoxide. If you have too much of that, that's actually going to bind to hemoglobin, and it takes the place of where oxygen would bind to hemoglobin. Where you might hear of carbon monoxide poisoning if a person falls asleep in a room that's not well ventilated, especially if they have something like a fire consuming oxygen as well. Basically, they'll go to sleep and die of carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, so we mentioned earlier, of course, that an increase in hydrogen would drop the pH. Okay, well, how are we getting this hydrogen? Okay, this is a buffer system. It's a very important buffering system of the body. We call it the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffering system. So what we see here is carbon dioxide is going to combine with water, which remember is all over the body. About 80% of our body has water, to form an acid. Okay, carbonic acid is a weak acid. And weak acids and bases dissociate, or what it means, break apart. Okay, they make great buffers. Something that's a buffer is something that resists changes to pH. Okay, so it splits it into the hydrogen, which of course is going to be your acidic component because it's going to lower pH, and what we call the bicarbonate ion, which is actually going to act as your base buffer. So where's this equation occurring? Most of it actually occurs inside the red blood cells because we have an enzyme. Remember, enzymes end in ASE. It's called carbonic anhydrase. And that's what speeds up this reaction. Okay, so we want to keep the pH of our blood between 7.35 and 7.45. Okay, that is the homeostatic range. Or you could see it like this, 7.4 plus or minus 0.05. Same thing. So if you go more acidic, okay, than 7.35 or more basic than 7.45, it can be fatal. Notice, though, that the overall pH of this is slightly basic or alkaline. So because of the equation we just looked at earlier, CO2, the amount of CO2 allows you to make acid, okay, hydrogen. So if you have too much CO2, you're going to be making too much hydrogen, and that's going to cause your blood to become acidic. And because this is something that's caused by the respiratory system, we refer to this as respiratory acidosis. Okay, so that would be when your blood pH is going to be less than the 7.35. Sorry, I ran out of room there. If you don't have enough CO2, you're not going to be able to make enough acid, so you're actually going to get higher than the 7.45. Okay, which would be too basic or alkaline. So we call that respiratory alkalosis. Okay, lastly, really we're just going to talk about one. There's lots of homeostatic imbalances other than pH, but kind of a common one, cystic fibrosis, is a congenital defect. That means something you're born with. and the respiratory mucosa, which basically you produce too much mucus. So it's actually something that you inherit, and I'm not going to ask this, but they do know exactly what chromosome that's found on. So too much mucus, and not only too much, it's very thick. So it's so thick that it's going to increase the resistance. So it makes it much more difficult to breathe. Also, because you have so much of this mucus, bacteria tend to stay in the mucus and you get infections all the time. So it's harder for them to breathe. They end up getting some congestive heart failure because of this, because of the fluid that builds up in the lungs and that backs up fluid in the heart. So they typically die of heart failure or a really bad infection. Usually bacterial infection will turn to a serious case of pneumonia. Typically before they're 30, sadly.